Who's Who is up next to paint a colorful picture of the cream of the crop of our community. To illustrate this segment is none other than the CIO of Montgomery County, Maryland, Mr. Sonny Siegel. Who is his guest today? Let's find out together.
Welcome to the Who's Who show. This is your host, Sonny Siegel. Today, my guest is none other than Mr. Aziz Haniffa. He is the editor and Chief Diplomatic and Political Correspondent of India Abroad. As many of us know, India Abroad is the most trusted, oldest, and largest paid South Asian newspaper in North America. It's currently owned by the largest news portal in India, Rediff.com. Aziz, it's an honor to have you on the show.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. I know you've been calling me for months, and I appreciate your patience and understanding, and I'm glad to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You know, most of us, many of us, have seen you in action. We've read your works, and we always wanted a few moments such as these with you, you know, to learn the story from the other side. In other words, the ones that you don't pen down, right? Yeah. And so today, I know my audience will be tuned in very closely, wanting to learn, you know, what your thoughts about some of the things that go on in journalism and reporting. And on that note, I want to thank you for your tireless works, you know, in covering the many issues that Indian Americans, Asian Americans, Pacific Americans, and Americans all around care about.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, you've been covering the U.S.-South Asia relations and the Indian American community for 30 years. And the news media and the world peers of yours have awarded you, acknowledged you. And so I know on the behalf of the viewers, I want to know which are some of the most exhilarating experiences you've had in getting those, clinching those exclusive interviews with celebrities, politicians, and such.
It's been hard work, and it's sustained work in a sense, because when you work for a small ethnic newspaper, although India Abroad has always tried to move out of the ethnic mold and into sort of the mainstream, but it's hard work. It's not the Washington Post or the New York Times calling senators, congressmen, prime ministers, presidents, and saying, I want to have an interview with you. But I think in some ways, it also has shown the evolution and the political involvement and empowerment of the Indian American community. Many a time when I would want to do interview with a senator, like for instance, when Senator Harry Reid was the majority leader, it would be very curious and very interesting to find that his family physician was an Indian American. And this is the backstory to how I have got many of those interviews with some of these very leading political diplomatic figures. I would call this Indian family doctor office and say that I want to interview Harry Reid, and believe it or not, Harry Reid would call me and say, Dr. So-and-so wanted me to give you a call. So, and the same with President Bush and others whom I've interviewed, President Daddy Bush, President H.W. Bush, as well as George W. Bush. There was a doctor in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, called Dr. Zachariah, who is very close to the Bush family and was one of the biggest fundraisers, is one of the biggest fundraisers for the Republican Party. And so I would approach Dr. Zach, who is a friend of mine, and say, look here, I want to interview the president. And it sometimes takes a while because they have to do all the background checks on you, and also when they find that you are a hard interviewer, that you are not going to throw softballs at them and you might occasionally throw a curveball, they get even more reticent, you know. So it's a case of pushing and using some of the sources and some of the friends of some of these leaders and political figures to get the kind of exclusives. And many a time India Abroad has scooped even the Washington Post and the New York Times in terms of some of these stories, because some of these interviews bring out facts that have not been readily available to the public domain earlier. So it's been a great ride, and it's been 30 years doing it, and every day is a fun day, and doing it has been a real joy.
Wow, what a secret you have shared with us. And gosh, I could translate that into things I do, you know, and how to get this scoop.
Yeah.
Yes. Now, speaking of awards, you have received the AIF award very recently. Why is that so special?
I think that's very important because AIF is one of the primary philanthropic organizations in the US. It's the American India Foundation, and it was set up when then Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee visited the US, and he had suggested, when he saw the Indian diaspora here and what contributions they could make to alleviate some of the issues and concerns of India in education, in alleviating poverty, in health issues, etc. He had in fact suggested that to President Bill Clinton. And President Bill Clinton was one of the founders of the AIF in the sense that he gave his blessings and support, etc. And there were some people like IIT alumni like Victor Menzies, Sudhakar Shenoy and others who founded AIF, and Rajat Gupta also, who was at the time Chairman Emeritus of McKinsey. So I think that was very important, and the fact that the award was for pioneering journalism and community service, which is very important to me. 30 years with India abroad, and that's one of the things that kept me going, the fact that I could do something in terms of reporting the evolution of the community, in terms of politics, in terms of diplomacy, and some of the immense contributions they have made. And I think AIF is important because besides getting this award from one of the primary philanthropic organizations which is doing work in India, it was also in a way, it sort of prompted other people and other really wonderful Indian Americans who have done very well, like Desh Deshpande, who started Akshaya Patra, Romesh Wadhwani, who's got his own Wadhwani Foundation, Ranveer Trehan, who has got his own Trehan Foundation, and also people like another Raj Gupta, who used to be chairman and CEO of Roman House, one of the biggest Fortune 500 multinational companies, to start his own Ujala Foundation. So I think, and apart from doing a lot of work in India, which is sort of the thrust of these organizations, they also mainstream and do work in the communities of America. And in that sense, they are giving back to some of their alma maters where they went to school and did graduate work, and which were in a way responsible for molding them. So I thought that was a very significant award and something that I really appreciate.
Yes, this definitely sounds outstanding.
Thank you.
You know, and of course I have to thank all the organizations you mentioned that make up the AIF for recognizing your wonderful work and contribution.
Thank you.
So, talking about some of the work and how it has impacted U.S.-India relations and the relations between our communities, creating trust, appreciation, understanding. After 30 years of covering the White House, the Congress, and so on, can you say how U.S.-India relations have changed over the past, well, since the 80s?
I think it's been tremendous. I think it's almost a 360-degree turn. I remember covering the Congress and the White House and the administration and Pentagon and everything else, the establishment, so as to say, in the 1980s, when India was considered sort of a surrogate of the erstwhile Soviet Union. You know, foreign policy at that time was sort of the good guys and the bad guys. You're either on our side or you're on the other side, you know. And India was, of course, very close to the Soviet Union, and the US never appreciated the non-aligned stance that India took. And I remember covering Congress, for instance, where the only friend that India had in the US Congress was a congressman called Stephen Solas, a Democrat from New York, who used to chair the Asia Pacific Subcommittee of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, which had jurisdiction over South Asian affairs. And he was like Horatio at the bridge, you know, fighting for India alone.
So
and there were guys, you know, there were the Dan Burtons, the Wally Hergers, who would introduce anti-India legislation on human rights. Then there was the Khalistani lobby at the time, the pro-Kashmiri independence lobby, and you throw Pakistan lobby into the mix.
Yes.
And then the transformation that took place, and in a way, what happened was also the seminal visit of Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi and his meeting with President Ronald Reagan. In fact, they described it as sort of the father-son relationship. They got along so well, and that was the beginnings of the transformation which was taking place, and also to a great extent, the demise of the Cold War was happening. And so the old partnerships, the old alliances didn't seem to matter anymore, and India could also come out of that fact that it was considered and perceived as a surrogate of the Soviet Union. So I think those were the beginnings of the India-US relationship, which began to blossom. And then I think, to a huge extent, the Indian American community has had a great catalytic role that they have played in terms of the US-India strategic partnership now, because it was the people-to-people connections, and there was also the scientific connections that were going on, the scientific collaborations. So to a great extent, the people-to-people connections, the Indian American community coming into its own, the contributions it has made, and a whole lot of things came together, and today I think it's almost on autopilot when it comes to the US-India relationship.
Right? So what do you see going forward?
I think of course, let's not forget that India and the US are going to have plenty of disagreements in the future. But as Ambassador Arun Singh always tells me, now both India and the US can be very candid with one another. They don't speak at one another, they speak to each other now. So I think in that sense, they can be very candid when they have disagreements. They can really brainstorm on it, see what can be done, what solutions can be found. And I think to that extent, the relationship can only go forward and will keep blossoming. Of course, there will be disagreements. There are issues, very geopolitical issues, which will put them on sort of opposite sides. But I think the relationship has matured to the extent where they can sort of get some kind of solutions to these disagreements without being disagreeable.
I see. So they'll play to each other's strengths through partnership.
Absolutely.
This is huge. And you just spoke to those periods in our lives, from the time of the Soviet alignment and the difficult calls that India had to make, and to the present times. And looking into the future, this is momentous. In other words, this is huge.
Yes, this is huge, really huge.
Yes, and we're here sitting talking about this, and we have you to cover all of these and put perspective on them.
Because just imagine people like Prime Minister Vajpayee talking about the US and India being natural allies, President Obama on many an occasion talking about the fact that the US-India relationship is one of the most defining partnerships of the 21st century. This is just amazing considering what was happening in the 1980s, during the Cold War.
Yes, it was very, very different. So the Indian American community, and of course our audience is very much a part of it, are we making an impact on politics in India and in the US? I mean, are we a force that to be counted with?
I certainly would argue that they certainly are a force. Sometimes there isn't enough of an appreciation of the sort of role that the Indian American community has played, but they play a tremendous role. Just take, for instance, the US-India civilian nuclear deal. It was the Indian American community that coalesced, that came together, and it's not easy for the Indian American community to come together. You get so many factions, so many regional factions, etc., but they came together on this common goal, and it was they who pushed their congressmen and senators to sign off on this deal, to approve this deal both in the House and the Senate. And remember, most of the Democrats in the House and also in the Senate are very strong non-proliferationists. They don't want nuclear plants in the US, let alone in India, but it was the Indian American community, and using a lot of clout and influence, and also the fact that they are big contributors to the campaign coffers of some of these congressmen, senators, who are able to leverage that and say that, look, you've got to sign this deal, you've got to approve this deal. And I think the fact that Indian Americans today have got beyond some of the traditional fields they were always in, you know, medicine, engineering, science, and all that. And they are also into public service. I think this has been tremendous, and the fact that I remember in the 80s there would hardly be any Indian American interns, let alone congressional staffers on the Hill. Today there are so many. They have got their own club of Indian American congressional staffers and aides and interns. They are just huge. So that and
presidential fellows.
Presidential fellows, and just imagine today the point person for South Asia at the State Department is Nisha Biswal, and the U.S. ambassador to India is an Indian American, Richard Verma, and then you get another Indian American who is U.S. ambassador to Sri Lanka. So and then Raj Shah was till recently, you know, the administrator of the USAID. Yeah, absolutely. So I think it is almost a given now. And then you get Dr. Ami Bera, who is the first congressman after Dalip Singh Saund after almost 50 years, and there is a very good chance that we are going to have two more. Pramila Jayapal in Seattle, Washington, I think is going to be a very strong candidate for the US Congress. And then Raja Krishnamurthy is almost a shoo-in from Chicago, Illinois. So hopefully we'll have three Indian American US congressmen. So I think all of those have come together, and the fact that, you know, Indian Americans are today even in the arts, cultures, you know, you get Indian American comedians who are doing well, who are on TV, who are doing so well on TV. So I think in a sense all of them have come together, that the education, the professionalism, the public service of Indian Americans have also in a sense buoyed this US-India relationship to a great extent.
So is it true that you actually were the only South Asian correspondent on President Clinton's visit to India?
Yeah,
that was at the year 2000.
2000, March of 2000, and yes, I was the only South Asian print journalist who was part of the White House press delegation that traveled with President Clinton in March of 2000 to India, and this was such a transformative visit and such a memorable visit because if you remember, First Lady Hillary Clinton and Chelsea Clinton had visited India and visited the rest of South Asia years before, and they had come and spoken to President Clinton about what a wonderful place it was and what a experience they have had, and he was just raring to go. But then you remember in May of 1998, India exploded those nuclear devices, nuclear explosions, and then boy, the relationship really went down the tubes. But once again the Indian American community came into its own, and then there was at the time Deputy Secretary Strobe Talbot, who met with External Affairs Minister Jaswant Singh. They were able to build up a rapport, and then in his last year of his second term, President Clinton was going to India, and it was such a memorable visit. He was in India for about 5 days. He traveled from Mumbai, he went to Hyderabad, he was in Delhi, and he was having all those meetings, and it was amazing, especially when he spoke to the Parliament, you know. It was such an experience watching his speech to Parliament. Here were these hardcore communists and anti-American guys, you know, like one of these rock concerts being passed by their stomachs because they wanted to shake the hand of President Clinton. And I think that was what really started the tangible transformation, the significant transformation of the US-India partnership and the relationship. And give credit to George W. Bush and now President Obama for running with the ball, really carrying the ball in terms of expanding that partnership to the next level. And that's why I say that it's almost a given that the maturity and the partnership of US and India today, I don't think can be sort of undone in a way, because it's almost on autopilot. Even though, like I said, there will be issues they will disagree on, but like I mentioned, they can disagree now without being disagreeable.
And you mentioned President Obama. When he was candidate for president, you were actually able to get an exclusive interview with him?
Yeah, that was very interesting, because at the time he was running against then Senator Hillary Clinton, and those beginning days he wasn't given a chance. He was like less than 2 points in the polls and etc. And what had happened was his campaign had put out a sort of statement attacking Hillary Clinton for sort of trying to outsource American jobs to India. And this was, they had picked up on a speech that Hillary Clinton had made to an Indian American group during a fundraiser. And there were all these young Indian Americans who were so enamored with candidate Obama at the time, and were working strongly for him. And this was like a bolt from the blue, you know. And so President Obama apparently had, and I think he was quite sincere when he spoke to me. He said he had no idea that his campaign staffers had put this out. And he called me while campaigning Iowa, and he called me on a cell phone, mind you. And this was another, in some ways it was a ruse that I did to get an interview with him, you know, because all these people and his supporters kept calling me and saying, President Obama, at least candidate Obama would never say such a thing and all that. I said, that's fine and dandy, but instead of quoting you, it'll be nice to get it from the horse's mouth, you know.
Yes.
So they all, in a sense, made sure that he would call me. And then he kept saying that I had absolutely no idea that my campaign had put such a thing out. I have the best relations and interactions with Indian Americans in Chicago. I used to interact, and he was very, very apologetic to the, and his cell phone kept going off a couple of times, and he kept calling me back. And I was amazed, and I said, Senator, you've made your point, you know. He said, no, I want to make sure that you get it right and everything else. And then, of course, being the journalist that I am and always looking for, you know, sidebars to the main story, I started talking to him about US-India relations.
So
it
went, he could reach the audience to whom it matters.
Absolutely. So that was the first ever interview that then candidate Obama ever did with a South Asian newspaper. And who knew at the time that he was going to become the next president, you know, because he was pretty low in the polls. And that's the last thing he wanted, to sort of antagonize the Indian American community, you know. And so that was resolved to the extent, and it was a wonderful experience.
You mentioned leaders in the U.S., presidential, presidents who paved the way. What about our Prime Minister's visits? You know, Prime Minister Modi's visits, have they been also instrumental in changing the relations?
Undoubtedly, undoubtedly. Without any qualms, I think the rapport between Prime Minister Modi and President Obama has just been excellent. And to that extent, you have to give credit that Prime Minister Manmohan Singh and President Obama got along very well too. In fact, President Obama had great admiration and respect for Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, because after all, he was a scholar, and people used to say it was almost like a professor and a student when they would have discussions. And it was during Prime Minister Manmohan Singh's tenure that the nuclear deal really came into its own. And to the extent that as much as President Clinton was responsible for the transformation that took place, and George W. Bush and President Obama running the ball, as so as to speak, on the other hand, as you know, beginning with the likes of Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee, followed by Manmohan Singh, Dr. Manmohan Singh, and now Prime Minister Modi, who has such a exemplary and wonderful rapport with President Obama. And so I think to that extent, the Indian leaders have also been part and parcel of this congruency that has helped to bring about this relationship to what it is today, you know, and US-India strategic partnership. And in fact, today in the US Congress, there are people saying that India should be named as a US ally. India doesn't want to get into an alliance with the US, but the fact that they're talking about, and mind you, just two decades ago, in your wildest dreams, you couldn't dream of congressmen and senators saying that India should be a US ally.
Yes, yes.
So this is the extent to which the relationship has grown. And catalytic forces like the Indian American community, people-to-people relationships have had a great contribution they have made in fostering this relationship.
Yeah. One of the trademarks of your career has been the very even coverage of an unbiased coverage of situations. In other words, we've had our share of you know, situations that could have been reported one way or the other.
Absolutely.
But I think yours has been stellar, you know, in that regard. I've been sort of following those.
Thank you.
And the civil, you know, the nuclear deal you mentioned.
Yes.
And then our own within our community, the issues with the Sikh situation, and many others. So I know, and I commend you for that.
Thank you.
Because you actually carry the bullhorn, even though in print media, right?
Yes.
And you can sway opinions.
Yeah, I think it's very important to the credibility and the objectivity of a reporter. That's what I try as much as I can to do, that when you report on something or you attend an event, that you report just the facts. We all have our biases, we all have our prejudices, etc. But as a reporter, I found it very important that you just try to report the facts as they are. But I also do my own editorials, which I wish I had much more time to do. But every once in a while I do editorials where I come down hard on some deficiencies of some community organizations or some shenanigans that's going on in somewhere or the other. But those are editorial comments which I make. But when it comes to reporting, I think it's important, and that's why I think to a great extent India Abroad is admired, it's trusted, because we've tried to be as objective as we can in terms of reporting the facts as it happened on the ground, and that's what we always endeavor to do.
Well, I want to wish you all the best, for the future, and I definitely urge you to keep up all these excellent things you're doing. Thank you for being on the show. I wish to have you back on the show again whenever you can find the time.
Thank you very much, Sunny. I really appreciate it. And once again, thank you very much for your patience and understanding. I'm so glad to be here with you today. Thank you.
It's been very worthwhile.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. This is Sunny Siegel signing off on the Who's Who show on the Capitol Forum. I hope to see you again next month at the same place and the same time.